Welcome to Sleepless Ancient Odyssey. The day is done. It is time now to let the noise of your world fade into silence. Find your most comfortable position, and for the next few moments simply relax. Tonight's Odyssey is about to begin. Tonight, our journey takes us to ancient Sparta, to the sun-scorched valleys of Laconia, where childhood was not a time of innocence, but a proving ground of survival. We will witness the transformation of boys into weapons. We will walk among the most disciplined society the ancient world ever produced, and we will seek to understand how a single city-state forged warriors so formidable that their very name still echoes through millennia as a synonym for courage, endurance, and martial perfection. This is not merely history. This is the story of how human potential was pushed to its absolute limits, where the price of strength was paid in childhood itself. Whether you are here for a story to captivate your mind or a grand narrative to accompany you to sleep, your journey starts now. If you enjoy these odysseys, subscribe and join us every time we travel to the past. Now, let us begin. In the heart of the Peloponnese, where the Eurotas River cuts through valleys guarded by mountains, there existed a city unlike any other in the Greek world. Sparta was not adorned with marble temples reaching toward the heavens. Its streets were not lined with monuments celebrating individual glory. There were no towering walls to protect its citizens, no elaborate marketplaces where merchants hawked their wares in colorful chaos. Sparta was austere. Sparta was discipline made stone and flesh. The city itself seemed to embody the philosophy of its people, stripped of all excess, reduced to pure function. Where Athens celebrated art and philosophy, where Corinth grew wealthy on trade, Sparta pursued a single obsession, the creation of the perfect warrior. Not merely skilled fighters, but men who embodied an ideal so complete, so all-consuming, that their very existence was a form of warfare. This obsession did not emerge from nowhere. It was born from fear, from necessity, from the peculiar circumstances of Spartan society itself. Let us understand the world that demanded such warriors. Sparta controlled Laconia and Messenia, territories rich in agricultural land. But the Spartans themselves, the Spartiates, the full citizens, were vastly outnumbered by those they had conquered. The Helots, the slave population that worked the land, outnumbered their masters by ratios that might have been 7-1, perhaps 10-1. The ancient sources disagree on the exact numbers, but all agree on this: the Helots were a sea, and the Spartans were merely islands within it. Every autumn, the Spartan state formally declared war on the Helots. This was not symbolic. Young Spartan warriors, the Crypteia, would move through the countryside at night, hunting the strongest and most intelligent of the Helot men, eliminating those who might one day lead a revolt. It was state-sanctioned terror, a yearly culling designed to keep a subjugated population in perpetual fear. The Spartans lived above a volcano of human resentment, and they knew it. Every moment of every day, they were aware that their comfortable lives, their political power, their very survival depended on military supremacy so absolute that rebellion would seem not merely futile, but unthinkable. This was the crucible in which the Agoge was forged. The Agoge was not simply a training program. It was a comprehensive system of education, indoctrination, and transformation that took boys at the age of 7, and through years of calculated hardship, produced men who viewed death in battle as the highest honor, who knew no loyalty greater than that owed to their fellow warriors, who would hold a battle line even as the world collapsed around them. It was, by design, the most demanding military training system the ancient world would ever produce. And it began in childhood, before a boy could even understand what was being taken from him. Imagine a boy of 7 years old. In most societies across the ancient Mediterranean, he would still be playing games, learning simple tasks, protected within the warmth of his family. His world would be small and safe. In Sparta, there was no such childhood. When a Spartan boy reached his 7th year, the state came for him. There was no choice in this, no appeal to be made. The Agoge was not optional. It was the sole path to citizenship, to honor, to being considered fully human in Spartan society. A boy who did not enter the Agoge would never be a Spartiate. He would exist in the shadows, neither slave nor citizen, claiming Spartan blood, but denied all that made Sparta meaningful. So, the separation happened. Families accepted it because they had no alternative, because their own fathers had endured the same trial, because to resist would be to reject everything Sparta stood for. The boys were organized into groups called ageli, herds. The word itself is telling. These were not classes or teams. They were herds, groups of young animals to be shaped and culled. Each agel was placed under the supervision of an older boy, usually around 20 years old, called an Irene. This older youth had complete authority over his charges. He could punish them, deprive them of food, order them to fight each other. He was their first teacher in the fundamental lesson of Spartan life. The hierarchy was absolute, and obedience was survival. But the Irene was not the only authority. The entire citizen body watched. Any adult Spartan man could discipline any boy. If a child misbehaved in the street, any passing warrior could strike him, interrogate him, shame him. There was no privacy, no refuge. The whole of Sparta was the classroom, and every moment was a test. Nay, the boys were given a single scarlet cloak. This would be their clothing for the entire year, regardless of season. In the scorching summers of Laconia, they would sweat beneath it. In the winters, when cold winds swept down from the mountains, this thin woolen garment would be their only protection. They were not given shoes. They walked barefoot over rocky ground, through thorns, across terrain that tore at soft flesh until it hardened into leather. They slept together in barracks built along the banks of the Eurotas, on beds they made themselves from reeds they gathered from the riverbank. These beds were uncomfortable by design. The reeds prickled and poked. Sleep was never deep, never truly restful. Even in rest, they were being hardened. But it was the hunger that defined everything. The Spartan state provided the boys with food, but never enough. This was intentional, carefully calculated. The rations given were sufficient to prevent starvation, but insufficient to satisfy. The boys existed in a state of perpetual hunger, their bellies never quite full, their bodies always crying out for more. Why? Because hunger was a teacher. A hungry boy is a sharp boy. His senses heighten. He becomes cunning, resourceful, willing to take risks. And so the Agoge encouraged, indeed expected, the boys to steal food. They were supposed to supplement their rations through theft, through cleverness, through the skills that would serve them as scouts and raiders in war. But here was the cruelty of the system. If a boy was caught stealing, he was beaten savagely, not for stealing. Theft was expected. He was beaten for being caught, for lacking the skill and cunning to avoid detection. The lesson was clear. Competence was everything. Intentions meant nothing. Results were all that mattered. The story is told of a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When he was questioned by an adult, the fox, terrified and confined, began to claw and bite at the boy's stomach, tearing through his flesh. The boy stood perfectly still, answering questions calmly, betraying no pain, no discomfort. By the time the interrogation ended, the fox had disemboweled him. He collapsed and died without having made a sound. Whether this story is literally true or apocryphal is beside the point. It was told because it represented the ideal. Pain was to be endured in silence. Detection was the only real failure. Death with honor was preferable to life with shame. The boys learned this lesson in their bones, in their empty stomachs, in their scarred feet and sleep-deprived minds. Physical training dominated the Agoge, but it was not the mindless repetition of exercises. Every activity had purpose. Every drill was designed to build specific qualities that would matter in the chaos of battle. The boys ran, miles and miles, every day, across the valleys and hills of Laconia. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs trembled with exhaustion, until running became as natural as breathing. Speed and endurance were cultivated with religious devotion, because in war, the ability to march further and faster than your enemy could determine victory before a single spear was thrown. They wrestled. Greek wrestling was not the ritualized sport we might imagine today. It was brutal and practical. Boys grappled in the dust, learning how to use leverage and positioning to overcome larger opponents, how to break holds, how to inflict pain efficiently. They fought until they were covered in bruises, until their bodies became maps of impact and strain. Pain was constant, and through constant pain, they learned to function through it. They trained with weapons from an early age. The dory, the long spear that was the primary weapon of the Spartan phalanx, became an extension of their bodies. They learned to thrust with it, to maintain formation while holding it, to understand its balance and reach. The xiphos, the short sword used when the phalanx dissolved into close combat, was practiced until they could draw and strike in a single fluid motion. But the most important training was not individual, it was collective. The phalanx, the tight formation of shields and spears that was the dominant military tactic of Greek warfare, required absolute unity. Each warrior's shield protected not himself, but the man to his left. To break formation, to step back even a single pace, was to betray your comrade, to expose him to death. The phalanx was effective only when every man held his position, trusted completely in the man beside him, and moved as a single organism. The boys learned this through constant drill. They marched in formation for hours, maintaining precise spacing. They practiced the othismos, the pushing match where phalanxes collided shield to shield and shoved against each other with the weight of massed bodies. They learned that individual heroics meant nothing, that personal glory was an Athenian delusion. There was only the line, the formation, the collective. This training was reinforced through constant competition. The Agile competed against each other in wrestling matches, in races, in mock battles. But these competitions were designed not to crown individual champions, but to identify weakness. A boy who failed his agile brought shame not just upon himself, but upon all his brothers. The social pressure was immense. Excellence was expected. Mediocrity was intolerable. And for those who could not meet the standard, there was no mercy. The weak were beaten by their peers, ostracized, mocked publicly. In a society where honor was everything and shame was a living death, this psychological warfare was as devastating as any physical punishment. Boys learned early that the collective was everything, that individual weakness endangered everyone. Some boys broke under this pressure. They became outcasts within their own agili, shadows who existed at the margins. Unless they could prove themselves through some extraordinary act of courage or endurance, they would carry this shame for life. Even if they survived to adulthood, they would never be fully accepted, never be given positions of authority or trust. Sparta did not merely train warriors. It bred them, selecting for qualities that transcended mere physical ability. But the Agoge was not purely focused on physical prowess. There were other lessons, subtler, but no less important. The boys were taught to read and write, though the Spartan approach to literacy was characteristically minimal. They learned enough to understand orders, to read military dispatches, to function within the administrative requirements of the state. But extended education in literature, philosophy, or rhetoric, the pride of Athens, was viewed with suspicion. Words could deceive. Words could undermine the simple truths upon which Spartan society rested. The boys were taught to speak in a manner that came to be known throughout Greece as laconic. Brief, direct, stripped of ornament. when Philip of Macedon sent a message to Sparta threatening that if he invaded Laconia, he would raze Sparta to the ground, the Spartan ephors sent back a single word, if. This brevity was not natural, it was trained, a deliberate rejection of the verbose rhetorical culture that dominated much of the Greek world. They were taught music, particularly the aulos, a double-piped wind instrument. This might seem strange in a society so focused on warfare, but music served a purpose. The Spartans marched into battle to the sound of the aulos, keeping time, maintaining formation through rhythm. Music was not art for its own sake. It was a tool of war, a means of coordination and cohesion. They learned to dance, specifically war dances that simulated combat movements, that taught rhythm and coordination, that turned the body into an instrument of precise, controlled violence. The Pyrrhic dance, performed in armor, was a display of martial skill disguised as ritual performance. And they learned cruelty. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Agoge, the element that separates it most clearly from modern military training. The boys were deliberately taught to view the helots as less than human, to treat them with casual violence, to understand that mercy was weakness and compassion was a luxury that could not be afforded. As the boys grew older, the most promising among them would be selected for the Crypteia, the secret police force that terrorized the helot population. These young men would be given a knife and sent into the countryside with orders to survive by their wits and to kill any helot they encountered at night. This was presented as a test of survival skills, of stealth and cunning, but it served a darker purpose. It taught young Spartans to kill without hesitation, to view violence against the enslaved as normal, even commendable. This systematic brutalization had consequences. It created warriors who could commit acts of extraordinary cruelty without moral qualm. When Sparta captured the city of Plataea, which had sided with Athens, they executed all the adult males, over 200 men, after a show trial. When they conquered cities during the Peloponnesian War, they typically killed the men of military age and enslaved the rest. This was not unusual in the ancient world, but the Spartans approached it with a mechanical efficiency that shocked even their contemporaries. The Agoge was creating something specific, men who could endure any hardship, who would never break in battle, who valued death in combat above all else. But it was also creating men who were emotionally stunted, who had been denied normal human development, who knew loyalty to the state and to their fellow warriors, but little else. As the boys reached their teenage years, the intensity of the Agoge increased. The training became more dangerous, the expectations more demanding, the consequences of failure more severe. Around the age of 12, the boys underwent a rite of passage at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. They were whipped at the altar, sometimes for hours, and were expected to endure this without crying out. The spectacle attracted crowds of Spartans who watched to see which boys showed courage and which revealed weakness. Some boys died from the beatings, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma. This was considered acceptable. Better to die proving your courage than to live having revealed cowardice. The Romans, centuries later, would turn this ritual into a tourist attraction, building seating around the altar so spectators could watch in comfort as Spartan youths were scourged. But in the classical period, it was a sacred ritual, a test that separated those worthy of citizenship from those who were not. Boys were encouraged to form close partnerships with slightly older youths, relationships that combined mentorship, friendship, and often erotic love. These bonds were seen as militarily valuable. Men fought harder to protect their beloved companions, would rather die than show cowardice before them. The Spartans were not unique in this. Such relationships were common in many Greek city-states and were often viewed as strengthening military cohesion. The famous sacred band of Thebes was explicitly organized around pairs of lovers, on the theory that men would fight with suicidal courage rather than appear cowardly before their partners. But in Sparta, even love was subordinated to the state. These relationships were encouraged only insofar as they increased military effectiveness. Emotional attachments that might conflict with duty to the state were viewed with suspicion. A Spartan was taught that his truest love was for Sparta itself, that all other loyalties were secondary. As the boys approached their 20th year, they faced their final trials. They had to demonstrate competence in all aspects of Spartan life: physical prowess, military skill, endurance, cunning, and adherence to the Spartan code. They were evaluated constantly, not just by their instructors, but by the entire citizen body. A Spartiate was a warrior and nothing else. His entire identity was wrapped up in military service and the maintenance of his status within Spartan society. They excelled within the narrow parameters of hoplite warfare, the set-piece battles, where heavy infantry clashed in tight formation. Sparta needed warriors, and warriors came from strong mothers. The women were encouraged to be assertive, even aggressive. A Spartan mother who learned her son had died in battle was expected to show pride, not grief. Mourning was weakness. This cultivation of toughness extended to the selection of which children would live. When a baby was born in Sparta, it was examined by the elders. If it appeared sickly or malformed, it was taken to the slopes of Mount Taygetus and left to die from exposure. This practice, common in some form across the ancient world, was carried out with particular rigor in Sparta. Only the strong were permitted to live, because only the strong could serve the state. Spartan women internalized these values. They raised their sons knowing that, at age 7, those boys would be taken from them, that they would see them rarely afterward, that they might die in training or in battle before reaching adulthood. And they accepted this because the alternative, to reject the system, was to reject Sparta itself. There are stories that reveal the psychological cost of mothers who showed no emotion when informed of their sons' deaths, maintaining the Spartan ideal of stoic acceptance, of women who killed sons who had shown cowardice, unable to bear the shame. Whether these stories are true or embellished, they reveal what Spartans believed about themselves, the image they projected to the world. The women were, in their own way, products of the same system that created the Agoge. They were taught from childhood that the state was everything, that individual feelings were to be suppressed, that Sparta's survival depended on the willingness of each generation to sacrifice the next. And so, the cycle continued. Women bore children knowing those children would be evaluated for their fitness to survive, knowing that sons would be taken and daughters would be raised to repeat the pattern. And beyond, all suggest that the Agoge was, indeed, an extraordinary and brutal system. What motivated the Spartans to create such a system? Fear, certainly, the fear of Helot rebellion, of being overwhelmed by those they had conquered, but also a kind of ideological commitment, a belief that excellence could be manufactured through suffering, that human nature could be reshaped through relentless pressure. The Spartans believed that most people were weak, that they gave in to comfort and pleasure, that they avoided hardship and pain. The Agoge was designed to eliminate these tendencies, to create men who could not be tempted, could not be frightened, could not be broken. It was an attempt to transcend normal human limitations through sheer force of will and systematic training. In this, the Spartans were both remarkably successful and ultimately tragic. They did create warriors of extraordinary capability. When Spartan warriors held a position, they did not retreat. But they paid for this with their humanity. The Agoge created men who were emotionally stunted, who knew only warfare and the rigid social codes of Spartan society, who were unable to adapt when the world changed around them. It created a society that could not sustain itself, that eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. No discussion of the Agoge can be complete without addressing its most famous demonstration, the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. The story is well known. King Leonidas led 300 Spartan warriors, along with several thousand other Greek troops, to defend the narrow pass at Thermopylae against the vast Persian army of Xerxes. When they were finally betrayed by a local guide who showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass, Leonidas dismissed most of the allied troops and remained with his 300 Spartans and a few hundred Thespians to cover the retreat. They fought to the last man. But the men with him were in their prime, the products of decades of training, irreplaceable assets to a state that could not easily produce more warriors. From a purely strategic perspective, the deaths were a disaster for Sparta, but the Spartans did not think strategically in the modern sense. They thought in terms of honor, of maintaining the reputation that made their military system effective. The 300 died at Thermopylae because to live would have been to admit that there were things more important than duty, that self-preservation could outweigh the demands of the state. And this is the fundamental paradox of the Agoge. It created warriors so committed to their code that they could not make rational decisions about when to fight and when to retreat, when to die and when to survive. It created men who were perfect instruments for a specific purpose, but who lacked the flexibility to question whether that purpose was, in a given moment, worth the cost. Thermopylae was a Spartan victory in the sense that it became a rallying cry for Greek resistance, that it demonstrated the capacity of determined infantry to resist even overwhelming numbers. But it was also a waste, a sacrifice of 300 irreplaceable warriors for tactical advantage that could have been achieved at lower cost. The Spartans themselves seemed to understand this on some level. They erected a monument at Thermopylae with the famous epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here Obedient to their laws, we lie. Obedient to their laws, not defending Greece, not protecting their families, not even seeking glory, simply obeying. This is what the Agoge ultimately produced: obedience, perfect, unquestioning, suicidal obedience. The Agoge ended in its classical form sometime in the Hellenistic period. The exact date is unclear. As Sparta declined in power and population, as the old certainties of the city-state system gave way to the dominance of larger kingdoms, the intensive training system became unsustainable. The Romans, who conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, found a Sparta that was a shadow of its former self. The Agoge still existed, but it had become a spectacle, a tourist attraction. Roman dignitaries would visit to watch Spartan youths being whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the ritual that had once been a sacred test of courage, now reduced to entertainment for foreign visitors. Eventually, even this diminished version faded. Sparta became just another provincial town in the Roman Empire, its warrior culture a memory preserved in texts and stories. But the idea of the Agoge did not die. It persisted in the imagination of military theorists, of philosophers, of anyone who believed that human nature could be reshaped through harsh discipline. The Agoge lives on in every drill instructor who believes that comfort weakens soldiers, that hardship reveals character, that men become capable of extraordinary things only when pushed past normal limits. Whether this belief is true is a question that has been debated for 2,500 years. We must, in examining the Agoge, confront the moral dimension. By any modern standard, the Spartan training system was child abuse on an institutional scale. 7-year-old children were taken from their families, subjected to deliberate starvation, beaten, forced to fight each other, taught to kill, and indoctrinated into a value system that prized death in battle above all else. The psychological damage must have been immense. Children need security, affection, the freedom to develop as individuals. The Agoge denied all of this. It created men who were emotionally repressed, who had difficulty forming normal human relationships, who could only truly be themselves in the context of military life. The elderly Spartans who gathered at the Syssitia every night because the communal meal was the only social context they truly understood. In the end, what are we to make of the Agoge? It stands as perhaps the most extreme example of a society attempting to shape human nature through systematic training. The Spartans believed that the qualities they valued, courage, endurance, discipline, loyalty, were not innate but could be instilled through careful, harsh education beginning in early childhood. They were, in a sense, proven right. The Agoge did produce men with these qualities. Spartan warriors were renowned throughout the ancient world, feared by their enemies, respected even by those who loathed Sparta's political system. But the cost was staggering. Childhoods consumed, families shattered, a society that could not be anything other than what it was, locked into a single mode of existence by the very training system that made it formidable. And ultimately, it was not enough. Sparta fell. The warriors produced by the Agoge could not prevent the decline of their city-state, could not adapt to new forms of warfare, could not preserve the system that had created them. Perhaps this is the real lesson of the Agoge, that human beings can be pushed to extraordinary achievements through systematic pressure, but that such systems are inherently fragile. They work only when the world remains stable, when the challenges they were designed to meet remain constant. It is quiet now. The barracks are gone, the training grounds overgrown. Sparta itself is a small town in modern Greece, its ancient glory preserved only in ruins and memory. But the questions the Agoge raises remain with us. How much hardship is necessary to build character? How do we balance individual freedom against collective need? What are we willing to sacrifice for security? How should we raise our children? And what values should we instill in them? The Spartans answered these questions in the most extreme way possible. They created a system that subordinated everything: family, individual happiness, intellectual freedom, artistic expression, to the single goal of military excellence. We have chosen differently. Our societies value different things. We believe that childhood should be a time of growth and exploration, not harsh training. We believe that individuals have rights that cannot be violated even for collective benefit. We believe that diversity of thought and lifestyle makes us stronger, not weaker. But on dark nights, when we wonder if we have made ourselves too soft, too comfortable, too unwilling to make hard choices or accept necessary sacrifices, the ghost of Sparta whispers to us. It reminds us that people can be harder than we imagine, that societies can demand more than we think possible, that there is a kind of terrible grandeur in absolute commitment to an ideal. We should listen to that whisper, but we should not follow it. The path Sparta walked led to glory, yes, but also to decline and destruction. The Agoge created warriors, but it also created a society that could not adapt, could not change, could not ultimately survive. We can honor the courage of the Spartans, the dedication of those who endured the Agoge, the extraordinary achievements of that small city-state in the Peloponnese. But we should not seek to recreate what they built. The Agoge belongs to history, a monument to human endurance and human cruelty, a reminder of what we are capable of achieving and what we should never attempt again. And now, as the stars turn above the silent ruins of Sparta, as the Eurotas flows on through the valley as it has for millennia, as the mountains of Laconia stand in darkness, our odyssey is complete. Whether you have journeyed with full attention to the end, or whether these words have accompanied you gently towards sleep, you have walked now through the Agoge, through history's most demanding crucible of warriors. You have seen what was created there and what was lost. Rest now. The ancient world with all its glories and horrors will be here when you return. And if you found value in this journey, remember to subscribe, so that we may travel together again through the vast landscapes of the past. Until then, sleep well.